എല്ലാ പൗരന്മാരും ആഘോഷിക്കേണ്ട ചരിത്രവിധിയാണ് മീഡിയാവണിന്റെ വിലക്ക് നീക്കി സുപ്രീം കോടതിയിൽ നിന്ന് ഉണ്ടായതെന്ന് മുതിർന്ന അഭിഭാഷകൻ ദുഷ്യന്തവേ. മാധ്യമങ്ങളുടെ അവകാശവും കടമയും ഓർമ്മിപ്പിക്കുന്ന വിധി കൂടിയാണ് സുപ്രീം കോടതിയുടേതെന്നും കേസിൽ മീഡിയാവണിന് വേണ്ടി ഹാജരായ ദുഷ്യന്തവേ പറഞ്ഞു.
Well, it is indeed a very historic verdict of the Supreme Court, especially coming, at a time when Prime Minister Modi, since 2014 election, has headed a very strong government, and a government which is not very, I would say, liberal about either the press or about the critics. And at a time, therefore, for the Supreme Court to remind the government that freedom of press is sacrosanct, and that but for the freedom, the robust democracy that we are, that India is, that will be under challenge. That is a very powerful message that Supreme Court has given, because what Supreme Court really says is that press really shines, gives a light on the functioning of the government, and unless citizens know that functioning is good or bad, unless press gives a true picture, the citizens cannot make a judgment about the functioning of their own government, the elected government, about their representatives. Therefore, citizens have a right, and unless citizens hear the truth, citizens can never make up their mind. They can never make a correct choice. So I think to that extent, this is an extraordinarily powerful judgment. This right of the press, or the freedom of the press, has been recognized by Supreme Court since 1950. But in the Romesh Thapar case, but for the Supreme Court to remind it today, at a time when Prime Minister Modi's very strong government is in power, I think is a very, very good reminder to the executive, to the press, and a great, I would say, it is empowering the citizen through this judgment. So to that extent, it is a very, very important judgment. There is no doubt about, there are many aspects that this judgment has dealt with. One of the first aspects that the Supreme Court deals with is the sealed cover jurisprudence, because as you are aware, that MediaOne's petitions were dismissed by the single judge and the division bench of the Kerala High Court, relying upon the sealed cover material which was presented by the government before the High Court. And relying upon that, the High Court upheld the ban against them. Now this, the Supreme Court strongly criticizes the approach of the High Court and says that by relying upon the sealed cover material, the High Court has effectively taken away from petitioner MediaOne their right to challenge the governmental action. And they say that this is violative of the very basic values, very basic fundamental democratic values that India has. Secondly, so far as the national security is concerned, the Supreme Court says that national security cannot be a bogey. It must be justified before the court. Merely giving a stamp of national security does not mean that every action of the government becomes, legitimate, and that court cannot go behind that. So this is for the first time the court now says that even if you think that it is your decision is in national interest or in the interest of national security, you must persuade the court by placing the material before the court, showing it to the petitioner, showing it to petitioner's lawyers that yes, this material is sufficient to take the view that government has taken in larger national security interests. So I think to that extent, the Supreme Court has very rightly observed that national security is not some kind of a bonanza which government has at its disposal, that they can simply stand up in the court and say national security, and therefore justify their actions. I think that the Supreme Court has now reminded them very, very sternly that you cannot simply wave this bogey at us. Court has therefore criticized the approach of the High Court in accepting the seal cover, which was accepted against MediaOne itself. So I think now the court is very clear that sealed cover jurisprudence is not a good jurisprudence, because it takes away the right of the petitioner to agitate before the court, and takes away his remedy. And the judicial remedy is a basic feature of the Constitution according to the court. So I think that's a very good, I would say, law that the Supreme Court has laid down. Every executive, when it becomes powerful, we have seen that happen during Mrs. Gandhi's time earlier. And we are now seeing, because Prime Minister Modi is also a very strong and a popular leader, so naturally the tendency is to not allow criticism of any kind. And these powerful leaders world over feel that whatever we are doing is good for the good of the people, and therefore nobody should criticize what we are doing, irrespective of the fact whether their decisions are good or bad. So that's a natural tendency which has developed over a long period of time, and therefore media has to stand up. And that's why Supreme Court very rightly says, so far as MediaOne is concerned, and I will quote, "The critical views of the channel MediaOne on policies of the government cannot be termed anti-establishment." So the court expressly went through and said that, look, all these what MediaOne has depicted, whether it is in CAA or whether it is in other cases or whether it was on 370 or whether it was on Jamia Millia issue, these are all issues that they have objectively projected for the people to understand, and therefore merely because they were critical of government's actions does not mean that they were wrong, or that was a sufficient material for government to say that MediaOne channel should be banned and should not be allowed to function. So I think it is very important for media that it must know its rights, but it must also know its duties. That both must be balanced. So and one thing media should always do is speak truth. And that is very important. In fact, one of the most important message that the judgment has given to the media is this, that a homogenized view on issues that range from socio-economic polity to political ideologies would pose grave dangers to democracy. And large section of the media today in India, print and electronic, give homogenized view on various socio-economic and political matters. And therefore citizens are not able to make up their mind independently. In fact, it arouses citizens' passions. It arouses anger. So it's not something which is good for us. So the court has said that don't give those homogenized views. Give independent views. Because your freedom does not mean you have a freedom to say whatever you like. The freedom is hedged by your duty. And that duty is to be truthful to the facts of every matter that you report. So I think to that extent, it is also a message for the media. It is also a recognition of the fact that the media is not functioning well generally in this country. MediaOne may be doing a good job, but there is one section of media which is not, doing a good job, and judges have given definitely a clear message to the media generally that you must conduct yourself properly. On that aspect, the Supreme Court has very categorically said that simply by saying that Jamaat, some shareholders have connections or there is some shareholding, that is no ground for government to really take the action of not renewing the license. And the court has said that that itself by itself does not amount to any substantive material which can show that national security is threatened. Therefore, they have very categorically analyzed that material and given their opinion on it. This judgment of the Supreme Court is, as I said, it will have far-reaching, I would say, impact on the country, impact on independence of press, because there is a section of the press which is fiercely independent. It may not be, a sizable section, but there is, especially the regional media. I have seen regional media in many parts of India. For example, in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, in many of these areas, the regional, as in Kerala, regional media is independent, and they objectively write about the actions or inactions or the good or the bad points of every government, and that is what is expected of them. And I have seen also that this independent media is being attacked by party in power at the center by unleashing income tax and other authorities on them, or by not releasing advertisements to them so that they don't get economic advantage. So the government always abuses its powers against media in more than one way. So this judgment to a great extent will, I would say, increase the powers and independence of the media, and I have no doubt that it will also perhaps now be a reminder to the government not to be vindictive against independent media and be tolerant of them. So I think it works both ways, and I have no doubt that the executive would also rethink about its approach towards independent media in future.